very much. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today for the launch of this very important initiative, the Ulster Centre on Multilingualism. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, perhaps just to put my talk in context. I'm lucky enough to be working in one of the best centres for the study of bilingualism in the world. That's the University of Edinburgh, where we study the bilingual brain from different points of view and at different ages. So we study bilingual children who learn 2 languages from birth, bilingual children who learn 2 languages one after the other, so one first and then another one, but during childhood. And we study adults who learn a foreign language. And by comparing these groups, we want to understand what happens, what makes it possible for people to have more than one language, and why there are age differences in so many respects. I'm also the happy parent of 2 bilingual children. I'm a native speaker of Italian, as you might have guessed. And my husband is a native speaker of American English, and we have 2 completely bilingual sons. I happen to think that universities have a great responsibility to encourage bilingualism, to make sure that there are more and more bilingual children, children who grow up with more than one language. So today, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the results of research. And I want to make it clear that it's not just my research or our research in Edinburgh, but the research that is emerging from many centres and laboratories in the world. Research is a collaborative enterprise, it's not an individual property. I'm going to show you why bilingual children are privileged, why bilingual children are lucky, how many benefits and advantages they get from knowing more than one language. Advantages that go well beyond 2 languages, as we'll see. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about our initiative, Bilingualism Matters, that has been just mentioned, and what we've done so far, and what the Ulster Centre on Multilingualism can also do, and I really hope we can establish a very fruitful collaboration between Bilingualism Matters and UCOM. So, first of all, what is bilingualism? People understand many things by bilingualism, some of which are very wrong, as we'll see in a minute. But one of the misconceptions is that a bilingual is someone who really knows more than one language perfectly, possibly from birth. So the perfect bilingual is what people have in mind when they hear the word bilingualism. And this is not the way I'm going to use this term. I'm using the term bilingual in a much broader sense. I'm using it to refer to someone who knows more than one language and uses both languages on a regular basis. Could be 3 languages as well. Everything I'm going to say applies to trilingualism as well. There may be questions about trilingualism later, but I'm going to talk about bilingualism for the sake of simplicity. So bilingualism doesn't mean perfect knowledge of 2 languages from birth. I regard myself as bilingual, although I grew up as a monolingual speaker of Italian, and I learned English in my teenage years. Because I use both Italian and English and sometimes other languages on a regular basis. And that makes me, according to my definition, that makes me a bilingual or a multilingual. So the general message today is that bilingualism gives children a lot more than 2 languages. There are some advantages that people are more familiar with. So, for example, the fact that there are social advantages of bilingualism. If someone who knows more than one language, they can travel more easily, they can communicate with people from other countries, from other cultures, and that's all very true. There are also instrumental advantages of bilingualism that many people are aware of. So it might be easier to find a job later on if a child grows up with more than one language. There are cultural advantages, so many bilingual children are faced with two cultures, and so they grew up more interested in other cultures, more tolerant of other cultures, which is certainly a very nice thing in today's world. But this is not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today is the cognitive advantages of bilingualism, the mental advantages of bilingualism. I'm going to show you how growing up with more than one language actually changes the brain in a very significant way. And in most cases, it changes the brain for the better. So, given what I'm going to tell you in a minute, first of all, why are there so many misconceptions about bilingualism? Now, you may think this is strange, you may not share these misconceptions, but I can tell you that they're out there and they're very strong. People hold false beliefs about bilingualism that come from, I don't know, from a long time ago. They're still very deeply rooted in our societies and in our cultures. So, for example, many people tend to believe that bilingual children are confused. So they think, my child is hearing two sets of words, two sets of grammatical rules. It's such a burden. I mean, will they ever grow up speaking any language properly? Will they ever learn to read and write a language properly? Will they have trouble when they start school? If schooling will be in English, for example, and the other language is Italian, or Punjabi, or Urdu, or Gaelic. I'm going to show you that there is absolutely no foundation to this idea. And in fact, I'm going to show you that bilingual babies are very good at keeping the two languages apart. So we really don't see many signs of confusion in bilingual children. There are other misconceptions. So for example, many people believe that if a child grows up with two languages, young brain, a burden, again, two sets of everything, this is going to slow them down in other areas of development. So they're going to be delayed in other domains. And this is a curious idea. It seems to presuppose that the brain is a box with a finite number of compartments, and if you put two languages there, or three languages in there, you're leaving less room for other things. Well, we know that the brain doesn't work that way. Absolutely not. The brain has a lot of potential. There's no space limit. And another misconception, there are more, but I'll stick to three today. Another common misconception is that precisely because many people think it's a little bit of a burden, it's an effort for a child, it might be worth doing it, but only if the child is learning two useful languages. So what does useful mean? Generally, for many people, it means widely spoken. So in much of the rest of Europe, English is the language that everybody wants their child to learn. There are other Western European languages that, follow close. In this country, maybe French, German, Spanish, maybe Italian, good fourth place. But what about Gaelic? What about Sardinian? What about Breton in France? What about other minority languages? Well, those, people think it's not really worth it. People don't speak these languages. Why bother? Why give the child this burden? Why, inflicting this effort on the child for these not very important languages? What about languages introduced by immigration? Those are not very prestigious, not as prestigious as English, German, French, etc. What about those languages? Well, I'm going to show you very soon that it doesn't matter which languages a child grows up with. It doesn't matter how many people speak these languages. It could be 5 billion people, or it could be 500 people on a remote island. It's the fact of having more than one language in the same brain that matters for what I'm going to tell you about. So, no foundations to these very common ideas. Research, in fact, shows that the opposite is true. And let's see why. We now have the means to study bilingual babies. These methodologies were not available until fairly recently. So now we can study very tiny baby, like the one on the left there. That baby is, well, I don't know how old he is, but it could be very shortly after birth. The baby is attached to a special dummy that connects to a machine. The machine can measure how quickly the baby is sucking on the dummy. So why is that? What does that matter? Well, because then we can play sounds in one language, and then the baby, sort of starts, sucking vigorously, and then if you keep playing the same sounds from the same language again and again and again, babies get bored like anybody else would, so they start sucking more slowly. And then they may be falling asleep as well. At that point, you change language. You start playing sounds in a different language. If the baby notices, if the baby is still awake, first of all, and if it notices the difference between the first language and the second, they will start sucking more vigorously. So the machine will register that the baby is sucking stronger. And that means that the baby has noticed the difference between the two languages. That baby on the right looks very happy, despite the fact that he's wearing this funny cap. So it looks like a funny swimming cup. In fact, that is a measure of the electrical activity in the brain. So by putting electrodes on the scalp of babies, or indeed anybody, it can be done with adults as well, we can measure how the brain reacts to certain sounds and words in one language as opposed to sounds and words in the other language. So by using methods like that, again, we know, people have found out in research, that even very tiny bilingual babies can tell the difference between the two languages they've been exposed to. There is some quite extraordinary early research on newborns that shows that even a newborn, so a newborn hasn't had the chance to hear much of languages since birth, but they may have heard these languages in antenatal life. So, because the fetus can hear a fair amount, so if more than one language was spoken in the environment before birth, the baby comes to the world already primed for those languages. That slightly older baby there is sitting on the mother's lap, and there is a screen in front of him. And on the screen there are images that appear, and the baby hears sounds. So every time he hears a sound, there is an image that appears on the screen, for example. Now, by studying eye movements, we know where the baby is looking and how long the baby looks at a particular image when they hear words or sounds in one language as opposed to the other. So again, that methodology, in fact a combination of these methodologies, can inform us about the ability of a very young child, long before they start speaking, the ability to separate the two languages. So by using methods like this, we know that babies separate the two languages very early on. They can distinguish the sounds of the two languages they've been exposed to, even when the two languages are very similar, which is really interesting. So my colleagues in Barcelona have a very famous lab where they study Spanish-Catalan bilingual children. And Spanish and Catalan, you may know, are quite similar indeed. Well, babies, very young babies, can tell the two apart. So they don't think they're sort of learning the same language spoken in funny ways. They know perfectly well when they're listening to Spanish and when they're listening to Catalan. What is even more fascinating is that babies use any cue, any piece of information at their disposal to separate between the two languages. So, for example, researchers have discovered that babies use the facial expressions and mouth gestures that go together with speaking one language as opposed to the other language. So, at 8 months, a bilingual baby can distinguish between the two languages just by watching a silent face. So that baby over there, again, is sitting, in front of the screen, and that woman, there's no sound. So there's no sound, and that woman is speaking sometimes French, sometimes English. And by using the combination of methodologies that I've described, we know that the baby can tell the difference, just on the basis of looking at the speaker's face. So it's quite remarkable what babies are sensitive to. Now, what about mixing languages? And this is another thing that, is related to this idea that a bilingual child is confused. Many parents worry about the possibility that their children might mix their languages. First of all, we have to say that children mix their languages a lot less than you think they might. Okay? They don't mix languages all the time. In many cases, they mix their languages on purpose because they know, for example, that the word in the other language expresses the meaning they're trying to get across better than the word in the language they're speaking. So they borrow that word from the other language because it serves a communicative purpose better than the word in the language they're speaking. Sometimes bilingual children mix for fun. In my family, my children had a whole range of very interesting Italian-English mixes. They knew perfectly well that those were invented words, words that don't exist, but they were a source of family entertainment. They still are. We remember many of these. Sometimes children mix not because of these reasons, but is this mixing a sign of linguistic confusion? I would say no, for 3 reasons. First of all, adult bilingual speakers mix too. There are communities in the world where speakers switch from one language to the other all the time, in most contexts. And that is not regarded as something that should be avoided, as some sign of confusion, in fact. It's actually part of being bilingual. Everybody does that. Children grow up learning because their parents mix and switch. The children mix and switch. And a lot of research has been done on how bilingual speakers mix and switch. And it's remarkable. It's not a random process. It doesn't involve taking a little bit of a language and a little bit of another language and putting them together in a kind of word salad. It doesn't work that way. It has a grammar, which means that there are precise rules that people follow when they mix and when they switch. So, for example, you can only switch at a particular point of the sentence, but not at others. Bilingual children grow up, they learn the rules of mixing, exactly the same rules that are then used by adult bilinguals. And there are sociolinguistic rules also, very important ones. So children mix when they speak to other bilinguals, but not when they speak to monolinguals. Why? Well, because children know, they become aware very early on, that if they mix with a monolingual, they're not going to be understood. So mixing and switching is a bilingual strategy that bilingual speakers use when they speak among themselves, when they speak to other bilinguals, not when they speak to monolinguals. So there are advantages for language and literacy of bilingualism that I'm going to tell you a little bit about. One of them has to do with spontaneous knowledge about language. So bilingual children notice how language works. What does that mean, really? I don't mean that they know the grammatical rules in the same way as we can learn grammatical rules in a foreign language classroom. Okay? We can recite grammatical rules. Children don't need those grammatical rules. They don't need those metalinguistic rules, those conscious rules. What I'm talking about is spontaneous knowledge of language, tacit knowledge of language. Because having different systems in the same mind actually draws the child's spontaneous attention to the features of language. It draws the child's attention to sounds, to words, to the way sentences are put together. And so this might be one of the reasons, this implicit, spontaneous understanding of language structure, why bilingual children are better language learners. So a bilingual child finds learning a third language, a fourth language later on, much easier than it is for a monolingual child. Having already two languages makes it easier to accommodate a third or a fourth system. At the level of words, we know that bilingual children have two labels for the same object. Okay? So that thing over there, for my children, is an apple, but it's also a mela. And because of this, bilingual children know that there's nothing natural in calling that thing apple, or indeed in calling it mela, because in different languages you call it in different things, in different ways. So they understand that the relationship between words and the objects they refer to is a conventional relationship. And that actually makes them, gives them more flexibility to learn vocabulary in each of their languages. Just to give you one example, all children, whether bilingual or monolingual, when they're young, they don't like the idea that you can call the same object in two different ways, so using two words for the same object. So for example, that thing in the corner is a dog, but it's also an animal. We know that because animal is a more general word, and dog, like cat and horse, etc., are more specific words. So there is a structure of vocabulary that initially children find it very hard to learn because they think there's only one word for each object in the world. But a bilingual child already knows that an object can have more than one label, more than one word, across languages, and that facilitates the learning of words within each language and not just across. So a bilingual child learns this kind of hierarchical relationship between words and classes of words within vocabulary at an earlier stage than a monolingual child. This attention that bilingual children have towards language structure also involves the ability to separate form and meaning. You can do a little experiment, as some researchers have done, with bilingual and monolingual children aged about 3 or 4, and you ask them, okay, if I tell you apples grow on trees, is that said in the right way or in the wrong way? And both bilingual and monolingual children might be able to tell you something funny there. They may not be able to tell you why. So growed, you're not supposed to say that because grow is an irregular verb in English and you have to say grew. None of that is known explicitly at that age, but there is an intuition that something funny in that sentence. Where you see the difference between bilingual and monolingual children, if you ask them, okay, if I say apples grow on noses, is that said in the right way or in the wrong way? Now, at the same age, a bilingual child will be much more likely to tell you that that sentence is fine, but the meaning is funny because apples don't grow on people's noses, and everybody knows that, right? So it doesn't correspond to the child's knowledge of the world, to our general knowledge of the world, but from a grammatical point of view, it's a perfectly fine sentence. At the same age, a monolingual child will be more likely to collapse the two and to tell you that that sentence is bad. It's not said in the right way. So this is an ability to separate levels of language, which again is very useful not only in language learning, but in other domains as well. In the domain of literacy, for example, so what is literacy? Well, literacy involves lots of processes, of course. learning to read and write. What I'm going to say only concerns learning to read. If you want, you can ask me about learning to write, but you shouldn't think that learning to read and learning to write are the same thing. Okay? So it is not the case that learning to write evolves from learning to read. So having said that, researchers have found that bilingualism actually facilitates the acquisition of literacy because it enhances some crucial components to literacy. And this is one of the reasons why many bilingual children tend to learn to read earlier than monolingual children. So they tend to be more precocious readers. And it's interesting that if a child learns to read in one language, that facilitates learning to read in a similar language. And I'm going to make this clearer in a minute. So again, this is a source of concern for many parents who ask me, is it a problem if my child learns to read in Italian, for example, knowing that they're going to go to school in English? So is that going to be a problem for learning to read in English? And the answer is no, it's going to be an advantage. So, two components that I'm going to briefly describe. First of all, a bilingual child realizes sooner than a monolingual child that print is read in the same way wherever it appears. Okay? So there is a stability of print. So words don't change meaning according to where they are. They're always read in the same way, and they mean the same thing. So you can do a little experiment with children. Again, you can give them pictures, and then you have pieces of cardboard or cards with words printed on them. So you take the piece of the card that says dog, and you put it under the picture of the dog. And then you ask, what does that word say? Dog, fine. What does that word say? Horse, fine. And then you make a little mistake, and the card that says horse accidentally ends up under the picture of the dog. Now you ask the children, what does that word say? At the same age, it has been found that a monolingual child is more likely to fall into the trap and tell you that that word says dog. Because they think that what matters is the picture that sits on top of it. A bilingual child will be more likely to tell you that that word says horse, even if it sits under the wrong picture. There are other considerable advantages for learning to read alphabetic languages. So an alphabetic language is like a language like English, a language like Gaelic, a language like French, German, Russian, Greek, even if they have different alphabets, but they still use an alphabetic script in a way that, for example, Chinese doesn't. Okay? So in learning to read an alphabetic language, what is the most important thing that a child has to discover? Well, they have to discover that each printed letter corresponds to a sound of the spoken language. So it has to discover that there are correspondences between letters and sounds. Now, a bilingual child is more sensitive to the sounds of their spoken languages. We know this from what they do in nursery, for example. They're better at nursery rhymes. They're better at alliterations. Games that imply an awareness, a sensitivity of sounds and rhymes and the sound structure of the languages. So, because of this facilitation that they have towards the sounds of the language, they are facilitated in discovering this important principle. Now, no child can read unless they discover this. They may be sort of reading at an early age simply by memorizing words as whole shapes. But they don't read until they discover this fundamental principle. Now, the correspondence between letters and sounds in English is not the same as the correspondence between letters and sounds in Spanish, or in Italian, or in Gaelic. So, different languages have different systems of correspondences between letters and sounds. A child who discovers this in one language doesn't have to discover it again in the other language. They've already discovered it. The only thing they have to learn is that the other language has a different system of correspondences. So my children, for example, learn to read in Italian before they learn to read in English. Italian is an easier language to read because these correspondences between letters and sounds are closer. It's more transparent. Italian is written in pretty much the same way in which it's spoken. The same does not apply to English, as many foreign learners of English know only too well. So it makes sense to start from the easy language, the easier language, and then move on to the more complex language. Again, you can do a little experiment with bilingual and monolingual children. Same age, they're not quite reading, but they're almost there, preschoolers. And you can ask them, which is the longest word? Is it train or caterpillar? Now the trick is that train is a short word that corresponds to a long object. Caterpillar is a long word that corresponds to a tiny object. So again, at the same age, we see the difference between a bilingual child who will be more likely to tell you that the longest word is caterpillar, even if the object it refers to is tiny, than the monolingual child who will be more likely to fall into the trap and think that what matters for the length of a word is the length of the object it refers to, rather than the number of sounds it contains and the number of letters that correspond to those sounds. So what have we seen so far? Bilingualism gives several linguistic advantages. So an early awareness of sounds, of words, of sentences, enhanced language learning abilities, earlier reading skills, and transfer of reading skills from one language to the other. Now let's go outside language. Outside language, first of all, we see that bilingual children are more aware of the fact that other people can have different perspectives or different points of view. So they understand, and this is a major milestone for all children. All children are initially very egocentric. They think they're the center of the world. They think that everybody can read their minds, and that, you know, they don't need to explain anything. Now they have to discover that that's not the case, that people can actually have different perspectives on the same object. So bilingual children learn that at an earlier age. Why? Because they, very early on, they understand that not everybody is bilingual. So they learn to classify people into bilingual people like themselves, monolingual speakers of language A, and monolingual speakers of language B. And we've already seen that that implies not only choosing the right language, but also choosing the right kind of linguistic strategies, like more mixing, for example. Okay? In order to understand this, a child has to step outside their own shoes, so to speak. They have to realize that not everybody is bilingual. And this realization is extended to other domains outside language, and make children better aware that other people can actually look at the same thing from different points of view. I'm going to give you an example again from research. So you have your bilingual and monolingual children, 3-4-year-olds, and you tell them a story. You say, okay, here's Bugs Bunny, and he has a piece of chocolate, and he puts this chocolate in a cupboard, and then he goes out of the room. While he's out of the room, here comes Daffy Duck, and Daffy Duck takes the chocolate and moves it somewhere else. So he moves it to the cupboard where it was, to, say, the top of the fridge. And then Daffy Duck leaves the room. Now, Bugs Bunny comes back in and looks for his chocolate. Where is he going to look for his chocolate? Now, the answer is clear to all of us. It's not so clear for a young child. Because the right answer is obviously Bugs Bunny is going to look for the chocolate where he left it, so in the cupboard. Because he can't possibly know that the chocolate has been moved. But the child who's taking the test, the child who's heard the story, does know that the chocolate has been moved. So in order to give the right answer, they have to distinguish between their own knowledge and Bugs Bunny's knowledge in the story. So again, it's the same principle, understanding that not everybody shares the same point of view. So a bilingual child gives the right answer to this problem at the age of 3, a monolingual child a whole year later at age 4. And then there are lots of advantages for what psychologists call executive function or executive control, which has to do with the way we use attention, the way we pay attention to things, the way we control our attention. So before I explain what I mean, let me tell you that bilingual children tend to be better than monolingual children at paying focused attention. That means paying attention to what matters and ignore other things that don't matter. So without being distracted by other irrelevant features or dimensions. Bilingual children are also better at switching between tasks. So they have more mental flexibility to adapt to a new task. Now, these are things that we all do in our everyday life. If you think about it, we all have to pay attention to what we're doing. We do many tasks in our everyday life, and there are many sources of distraction that we have to filter out. So it's a very useful thing to have, and it has been found that it's not just bilingual children that are better at this, in these respects, but also adults who have grown up with more than one language. Also, elderly people who have used more than one language all their lives. Let me give you another example. So, suppose that you have bilingual children and monolingual children, and you have shapes of different colors. So these could be plastic shapes or cardboard shapes, it doesn't matter. They're all mixed up in a single pile. And first of all, you tell your children, okay, I want you to sort these things out by shape. So this means putting all the triangles in one pile, all the squares in one pile, all the circles in a different pile. And color doesn't matter, okay? And children do this for a while, and then you say, okay, put everything back in the same pile. Now, I want you to sort these things out by color. Now, all the red objects go in one pile, all the green objects in one pile, all the blue objects in one pile. What is interesting is that many children, especially if they're on the young side, they initially may continue to do what they were doing before. And then they switch to the new task. Notice that the first task involves paying attention to shape and ignore color. But then the second task involves a reversal of this. It involves paying attention to color and ignore shape. So what happens is that bilingual children adapt to the new task faster than monolingual children. So it takes them less time to quickly switch and forget what they were doing before, adapt to the new task. Now, these are preschoolers, but 3-4 years old. Babies, it has been found, have this advantage too, which is very interesting because babies haven't had as much exposure to the languages. So with babies, we can do an experiment of the kind I've described. So the baby is sitting on the parent's lap, there is a screen, and every time they hear a word, it's a made-up word, it's not a real word, a face appears on the screen, but always on the left. Okay? So the children hear bi-da-da, and the face appears on the left. And then again, bi-da-da, and the face appears on the left, many times. After a while, well, we may say children get bored, yes, but more to the point, they start looking to the left even before the face appears. Because they've learned. They've learned that the face is going to appear on the left. It's done that up to now. And this is where your evil researcher changed conditions. So they change the word, and this time the face starts appearing on the opposite side of the screen, on the right. So the baby is initially a bit confused. Where am I looking? Oh, look, it used to appear there, but now it's appearing there. Right, where am I looking? Now we can measure how long it takes to babies to start expecting the face on the right. So to consistently look at the right-hand side of the screen. At 7 months, it's been found that bilingual babies are faster at adapting to the second task than monolingual babies. It's the same principle of the experiment I've shown you before. Potential longer-term advantages, the media have actually grabbed this result and blown it up out of proportion, probably. You may have heard about the fact that bilingualism may delay dementia. And some studies actually have shown that. The problem is that we need a lot more research. The studies on children, there's a lot more robust evidence for the results on children. The studies on the elderly, we need a lot more controlled research. The studies are promising, however, because they seem to show that if you've used more than one language all your life, then you're going to maintain your cognitive functions for longer. Now, certain cognitive functions deteriorate for everybody. This is absolutely normal. You don't need to get dementia. Some aspects of memory start declining very early on. Do you know at what age? Are you ready? At age 20, they start declining already. But they decline in a very imperceptible way. So it takes a long time, it takes decades before you realize. Okay? But the peak of many cognitive abilities is about 20. If you're a bilingual, you're going to age better. You're going to maintain these cognitive functions better. And the more languages were spoken in life, apparently, the better these cognitive functions are maintained. Now, bilingualism can't stop people from getting dementia because it has nothing to do with that. But the symptoms of dementia, as has been found in these few studies, show up to 4 years later. So this is an amazing result. If it was confirmed by further research, it would have amazing implications for public health, for example. Think about it, 4 years. 4 years is a long time in terms of care for the elderly. Anyway, we need more research, but very encouraging results. Now, to talk about the tasks that we've just described, all these tasks involve, first of all, paying attention. They involve monitoring what you're doing, so understanding where you are in the task. They involve focusing on one dimension, either shape or color, and ignore the other dimension, so either color or shape. It involves switching to the new condition and, in a sense, update your mental set of the task. And researchers are really trying to pinpoint at the moment where the bilingual advantage really lies. It could be more than one thing. It could be a particular aspect of executive control. The jury is still out, but we see these advantages. So what we've seen so far, bilingualism gives children an enhanced awareness of the other. It gives them mental benefits, including selective attention, better ability to switch between tasks, better ability to monitor behavior. And now you may be asking why? Why are there all these advantages? One of the reasons seems to be that in all bilinguals, both languages are always active. And if there are 3 languages, all 3 languages are always active. Which means that you can't switch off a language in the morning knowing that you're not going to need it. So I couldn't switch off Italian this morning because I didn't need it. In fact, I'm actually doing my best to fight Italian while I'm speaking English to you. So bilinguals have to filter out the language they're not using when they speak the other. And this is the mechanism that is extended outside the language experience to these situations that require attention on one dimension and filtering out other dimensions. So, if this is the reason, let's go back to the first point. It doesn't matter which languages. It doesn't matter how many people speak these languages. because it's the fact of having two languages, it's the fact of using both languages that gives children these advantages. So there are no useful or useless languages from this point of view, and this is a very powerful message that we can pass across to people. So there are always, these are powerful arguments for keeping all languages, for keeping all minority languages, regardless of where they come from, because they give children these advantages. So minority languages are an opportunity. I'll go beyond that. Minority languages are a privilege. So families where minority languages are spoken, they should feel privileged rather than having a problem, as in many cases they do, or they underestimate the importance of their language. So what's the best time to raise a child bilingual? As early as possible. From what we've said, we've seen that babies are perfectly able to keep the two languages separate. And so it doesn't make sense to wait to introduce another language until the first language is well established. I've heard this from many, many families. They thought in perfectly good faith that this was the thing to do. But this is in fact a way of depriving the child of input in the most crucial years. And it's also more difficult to introduce the other language later on if you've already established linguistic habits in your family where your child is used to a parent speaking a particular language. We know that the best window of opportunity for becoming fully bilingual is early childhood. We also know, however, and this is good news, that even if a child learns another language later on in childhood, that first of all is more likely to result in fluent, active bilingualism, but also it gives children some of the same cognitive advantages that I've described. So there's no, in fact, most research has been done on consecutive bilingual children rather than simultaneous bilingual children. So there's no reason to think that if your child is not bilingual from birth, they've missed the train. It's false. Our research, in fact, has shown that even child second language learners enjoy these benefits. And I'm not going to tell you anything about adult second language learners, although you may be wondering. We are working on that to see if adults who learn a foreign language and reach a very high level of proficiency also enjoy some of these benefits. So bilingual children need to hear enough of both languages, and this is a very important principle. It doesn't matter having parents who speak different languages, because unfortunately there's no genetic transmission of these languages, and children actually need to hear them. And that requires some planning, some consistency on behalf of the family. The family has to create opportunities for these languages to be heard, for the child to want to use the languages because it's fun, because they're motivated to use them. And there are many different patterns and recipes. There's no magic method that ensures that if a child will grow up bilingual. One parent, one language is the one that many families know. Parents speak different languages, each their own language, but it's not the only one. Because in fact, many families prefer to speak the minority language at home, leaving the community language outside the home, on the assumption that if a child grows up here, they will learn English, even if it's not spoken in the family. Or some families may speak the community language at home, and the child is exposed to the minority language in a school or a program that is taught in that language. So Gaelic medium education would be one of these possibilities. Any of these methods will work if it provides enough input in both languages and enough motivation for the child to use both languages. And in a sense, we've seen that it's difficult to do wrong, because the more input you give to a child in a particular language, the better they will learn that language. But we see that frequent switching from one language to the other is also one of the factors that enhances mental flexibility. So, if a child grows up in an environment where there is frequent switching, for example, because they speak one language with mommy and a different language with daddy, that is good from the point of view of mental flexibility. And there is a continuum of possibilities from a rigid separation of languages to both languages being used in all contexts all the time, and anything in between. And the perception of the minority language is, needless to say, very, very important. Children are incredibly sensitive to what people think about their languages. They know if parents, if schools, if society thinks that those languages are unimportant. And they may not want to learn it, even if they are in ideal conditions for learning it. So children need to realize that both languages, both cultures are valued in the family and outside the family, and also that both languages can really be used for all situations. So there is no important language that is used in public situations and the little family language that is used only with mommy or daddy. In fact, the language that is spoken at home is also spoken by many people outside the home. And this is a very important realization for children, to discover that there are many speakers of that language. It's one of the recommendations that I usually give to parents. Try to find different speakers for this language, because your child will benefit from variation, hearing the language spoken in different ways by different people. So, I'm coming to the end. Monolingualism is not a disease, we know that, but given all the benefits of bilingualism, what can we do to encourage multilingualism? So attitudes towards multilingualism need to change. We've seen that there are many misconceptions out there, and one way we can defeat these false beliefs and misconceptions and change attitudes is by giving people the correct information about bilingualism. And this is where I'm coming to bilingualism matters. Having the correct information allows all sectors of society. It allows parents, but also teachers, and policymakers, and health professionals, and politicians. If they have the correct information, they can make informed decisions, not decisions that are based on misconceptions, as we've seen before, but decisions that are based on facts. They're based on research. And they're based on an awareness that learning languages and encouraging multilingualism means investing on better grades. And this is a very important message for this country in particular, if I may say so, because this country has the privilege of speaking a language with world status, but that's also a limitation, because there is an incentive or motivation to learn languages. So multilingualism is undervalued because everybody speaks English, or at least people think that everybody speaks English. It's not even true, but certainly, there is a lot of that. So it's important, particularly in this country, to persuade people of the value of having more multilingual children, more multilingual people, which means having better citizens. Ultimately, it's the economy that benefits from multilingualism, and not only individual families. So if people are aware of the benefits of bilingualism, first of all, they can exploit existing opportunities, or create opportunities. You'll be surprised by how many families actually could raise their children bilingual because they speak different languages. They choose not to, because they think it's a useless language, etc., etc. Awareness of the benefits of bilingualism can actually help decisions to invest more resources in language learning, both in the preschool years and in the primary school years. I'm glad to say that we are now working with the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government has decided to lower the age of first exposure to languages in primary schools. It's a very big improvement compared to the status quo. So it's terribly important that these decisions are based on knowledge of the facts. It helps people to recognize that languages introduced by immigrant families are a resource rather than an obstacle. And the parents of immigrant families need to be persuaded of this in the first place, because they are persuaded that their language is an obstacle, and it puts their child at a disadvantage. Whereas in fact, if they keep their language rather than forcing themselves to speak broken English, and I've seen many cases like this, if they keep their language, their child will learn English faster, better, and they will enjoy the benefits of bilingualism. And finally, no minority language can be maintained without bilingualism. So no minority language can survive if it's not learned by children. And no amount of political intervention from above can stop the process if a language is not learned by children. So this applies to Gaelic, and we're doing a lot of work with Gaelic. It applies to all minority languages that are declining because they are not learned by children. So Bilingualism Matters was created to precisely to disseminate correct information about bilingualism, and we have grown a lot over the 3 years of our existence. We deal with 3 areas. We deal with language learning exposure in the preschool and primary school years. We deal with the maintenance of home languages in immigrant children. We deal with the maintenance of regional minority languages. We have a website that contains frequently asked questions, resources, events, general audience references, easy to read references that can be downloaded. We have an email service that works only in English and sometimes in Italian, for obvious reasons. We give talks in the community. We give many talks in the community to everybody. We give consultancies for the private sector, for international companies and organizations. We're planning an event with the Financial Times in London, where we will be addressing businesses and enterprises to talk about the importance of investing on multilingualism from the point of view of businesses. And we had very, very limited aims at the beginning, and this might be your story as Ulster Centre on Multilingualism. We started very small. We started from Edinburgh, in fact, because we were aware of all the work that needs to be done in Edinburgh only. And then we started attracting attention outside Scotland. There is a great demand for information. We started getting attention from the private sector, including banks, independent schools, companies. We started talking to the Scottish Government, and we started establishing partnerships with the Council, with education authorities, with the European Commission. And we started opening up branches outside Scotland, outside Edinburgh, I should say. So we have a branch in Norway at the moment. We have one in the Western Isles, in Stornoway. We have one in Greece. We will open one in Italy in October. We will hopefully open one in Sardinia, we hope by the end of the year. And we also have a very good partnership with the Child Bilingualism Network in Cambridge, which is something similar to your initiative and which was also inspired by us. So we have a partnership with them. So, welcome. The more we are, the better. I'm so delighted that you are launching this service, and I really, really hope that we will develop a partnership between you and us, and we'll work together in our respective communities, but also in developing common strategies in areas of overlap, and there are many areas of overlap between our situation and your situation. So all the best for the future.